All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Let's just dive right into this today, because the story we're unpacking is honestly absolutely gripping. We are literally tracing the origins of the biggest leak of government secrets in history. And to do that, we actually need to start in December of 2012. Imagine this. A journalist named Glenn Greenwald is sitting in his home in Rio de Janeiro, and he gets this incredibly cryptic email from a total stranger.
"I've got some stuff you might be interested in." That was the hook. Just that. But this anonymous sender insisted on using heavily encrypted channels and warned that he was risking his freedom and maybe even his life to share what he claimed was the biggest story since the Pentagon Papers. I mean, the tension was palpable. Eventually, this mysterious source, who went by Verax, which actually means truth teller in Latin, invited Greenwald and documentary filmmaker Laura Poitras to a secret, in-person meeting. Their destination was the Mira Hotel in Hong Kong, and the instructions were straight out of a spy novel. They were told to look for a man carrying a scrambled Rubik's Cube. Now, the journalists were totally bracing themselves to meet some grizzled, retired CIA veteran, right? Maybe a guy in a trench coat with receding gray hair. But instead, they're greeted by this thin, 29-year-old kid named Edward Snowden. It was an absolute shock.
So, you really have to wonder, who actually was this 29-year-old kid? And what exactly were these crown jewels of intelligence that he was handing over on a simple thumb drive? Well, to truly understand the sheer scale of this and the motivation behind Snowden's massive leak, we kind of have to hit pause and flash back 12 years earlier, to a day that fundamentally changed America.
We're going back to the morning of September 11, 2001. As the attacks unfolded, the shock inside the National Security Agency, the NSA, was profound. Think about it. This agency was explicitly created after World War II to prevent another Pearl Harbor. Yet, on this brilliantly clear Tuesday morning, the top leaders of the NSA were literally watching the attacks unfold on a cheap $300 television tuned to CNN. Their massive, multi-billion-dollar intelligence apparatus had completely missed the plot.
The immediate response across Washington was just this desperate, chaotic scramble to make sure this never happened again. While Vice President Dick Cheney was evacuated down into a deep underground bunker, his lawyer, David Addington, immediately started drafting orders to push the president's constitutional authority to its absolute breaking point. Cheney effectively turned to the heads of the CIA and the NSA, told them to take the gloves off, and said, "Make me a shopping list of whatever you need to aggressively monitor threats."
And that directive birthed what insiders simply called the program. This was a highly classified initiative secretly authorized by President George W. Bush. And the core concept here was dragnet surveillance. Instead of going to a judge and getting warrants to tap specific known suspects, the government decided to just collect trillions of records. Who's emailing whom? Who's calling whom? Across hundreds of millions of ordinary Americans, meaning potentially your calls and your emails. They were gathering up the entire haystack just to search for a few unknown needles.
Now, this is absolutely crucial, because it reveals a pivotal choice the government made. Before 9/11, the NSA actually already had a working surveillance prototype called ThinThread. It was designed by a brilliant crypto-mathematician named Bill Binney. ThinThread could sift through massive amounts of data, sure, but it automatically encrypted the identities of U.S. citizens. It had built-in privacy, meaning you still needed a court warrant to unlock a specific name. But for the program, the administration explicitly chose to strip those privacy protections away entirely, creating a warrantless domestic dragnet. Inside the NSA, this drastic shift set off massive alarm bells. An internal rebellion started brewing, spearheaded by an NSA senior manager named Thomas Drake. Drake realized that the privacy rules he'd sworn an oath to uphold were just being completely bypassed. But when he took his concerns up the chain of command, questioning the legality of all this warrantless spying, the agency's top lawyers flatly shut him down. They told him, "Don't ask any more questions, Mr. Drake."
But here's the thing, Drake wasn't the only one asking questions. A growing chorus of highly placed insiders became totally convinced that the program was a direct, blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment. You had the actual creators of ThinThread, Binney, Weeb, and Loomis, who were so disturbed they resigned in protest. You had Diane Rourke, a fiercely conservative staffer on the House Intelligence Committee, and Thomas Tamm, an attorney over at the Department of Justice. These were devout patriots who genuinely believed their own government was breaking the law.
And that pushback eventually escalated to the absolute highest levels of the Department of Justice. When a top DOJ lawyer named Jack Goldsmith concluded that parts of the surveillance program were in fact illegal, the White House pushed back furiously.
Vice President Cheney's lawyer David Addington got in Goldsmith's face and literally yelled that if the DOJ pulled their legal endorsement, the blood of 100,000 people killed in the next attack would be on his head. Talk about pressure.
This internal panic culminated in what has to be one of the most dramatic, cinematic showdowns in modern political history, the hospital confrontation of March 2004. Attorney General John Ashcroft was severely ill in the ICU with pancreatitis. Because the DOJ was threatening to stop reauthorizing the program, White House officials literally rushed to Ashcroft's hospital bed to try and force his signature. But miraculously, this frail, ashen Ashcroft lifted himself up from the bed, clearly explained why the program was legally flawed, and flat out refused to sign.
Despite all these internal crises, the surveillance just kept going, which led to an incredibly stressful path to publication. Agonized over the illegality of it all, DOJ attorney Thomas Tamm nervously used a subway payphone to tip off the New York Times in 2004. But get this, after intense meetings with top administration officials, the Times actually spiked the story for over a year. It wasn't until Times reporter James Risen threatened to just publish the details in his own book that the newspaper finally exposed the program to the world in December of 2005.
Now, the reason the Times held the story for so long was due to immense direct pressure from the Oval Office. President George W. Bush personally summoned the publisher to the White House and played his trump card. He explicitly warned them that if they published the existence of this program and another 9/11 occurred, the New York Times would be complicit. He said they would have blood on their hands. I mean, that is an incredibly heavy burden to place on journalists.
But once the story finally broke, the government swiftly deployed a three-step response. First, the president publicly admitted to a highly minimized, sanitized version of the program, conveniently leaving out the vast domestic dragnet entirely. Second, top officials publicly denied that anyone inside the NSA had ever dissented. And third, behind the scenes, the administration unleashed a massive FBI manhunt to track down and punish the whistleblowers who leaked to the press.
That manhunt culminated on a devastating morning in the summer of 2007. At exactly 9 a.m. Eastern Time, armed FBI agents raided the homes of Bill Binney, Kirk Weave, Ed Loomis, and Diane Rourke. We're talking guns drawn, pulled out of the shower, homes torn apart, computers seized. These individuals had served their country faithfully for decades, and suddenly they were being treated as enemies of the state, patriots turned into prime suspects.
And the stakes here were unimaginably high. Just look at Thomas Drake. Despite only ever blowing the whistle through proper internal channels and only sharing unclassified info with a reporter, federal prosecutors targeted him hard. They sat him down and threatened him with 35 years in federal prison under the Espionage Act. They were aggressively trying to force him to confess to a conspiracy that didn't even exist. So, with the whistleblowers facing decades behind bars, all eyes naturally turned to the 2008 presidential election. Candidate Barack Obama was actively campaigning on a promise of no more secrecy. He vowed to protect whistleblowers and heavily criticized the unchecked surveillance state. So the burning question was, once he actually got into the Oval Office, would this new president dismantle the warrantless wiretapping apparatus? Well, surprisingly, the answer was no. Upon taking office and getting fully briefed on what the program could actually do, the Obama administration chose to keep it largely intact. In fact, with Congress passing laws that validated and expanded the NSA's powers, the agency entered what insiders literally called the golden age of surveillance. The budget absolutely ballooned to over $10 billion a year, and the intelligence community started relying heavily on highly skilled private contractors to manage all this data.
And what happened to the Bush-era whistleblowers? The new administration just continued their aggressive prosecution. The stance was crystal clear. If you leak classified information regarding national security, we are going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. All that campaign rhetoric celebrating whistleblowers, it definitely did not stop the Department of Justice from aggressively enforcing the Espionage Act.
This relentless pursuit led directly to the tragic fall of Thomas Drake. He spent 2 full years draining his entire life savings just to defend himself in court. He was financially ruined, alienated from his peers, and actually ended up working at an Apple store just to survive. Now, ultimately, the government's felony case completely fell apart, and Drake took a minor misdemeanor plea deal. But the message to the rest of the intelligence community was received loud and clear. If you speak out, you will be hammered.
Which brings our story full circle to a young NSA contractor stationed in Japan and Hawaii, Edward Snowden. See, Snowden had access to a highly classified Inspector General's report that detailed the entire secret history of the program. He read exactly how the laws were bent. He watched the Obama administration maintain the surveillance. And most importantly, he saw firsthand how whistleblowers like Thomas Drake were utterly crushed for trying to play by the rules.
Snowden realized that using proper internal channels was a dead end, and he felt that just going to domestic newspapers might result in the story being suppressed for years, all over again. So utilizing his unique superuser IT access, Snowden quietly walked out of the NSA with an estimated 1.7 million classified documents. He knew that to actually be believed, he couldn't just have allegations. He needed massive, irrefutable, undeniable proof.
And that is exactly why we ended up in that hotel room in Hong Kong. This became the largest leak of classified information that had ever occurred in the history of the United States. Snowden basically used the devastating failures and the ruthless prosecutions of past whistleblowers as a direct blueprint for his own actions. He bypassed the system entirely, and in doing so sparked a massive global conversation about government overreach.
Which leaves us with a really profound final thought to take away from this explainer today. As the sheer capacity for digital surveillance continues to grow exponentially, faster than we can even comprehend, where exactly is the line between keeping a nation safe and protecting the fundamental privacy rights of its citizens? It's a delicate, complex balance that we are very much still fighting over today. Thanks so much for joining me to explore the roots of this incredible story. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.